Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on planet Earth, which is in a fast forward moment in its history and our history. And today we're going to, this is Andy Revkin. I'm at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, although I'm speaking to you from the Hudson River Valley in the Highlands, about 50 miles north of New York City, where I've lived since 1991. And the exploration today on Sustain What is of cities and resilience and looking at an area of the earth where the change is even more rapid than in most places, where the risks largely relate to water, too much and not enough, and where Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, particularly a unit there on urban resilience, has been working on the ground in cities from Mozambique up through Israel, actually, into the Middle East, uh, testing ideas for how to build resilience. Now, as I say on this broadcast, the reason I called this Sustain What is because I feel the word sustainability is the most overused and ill-defined word, one of the most overused and ill-defined words in the human language. And resilience is another one that has that abstract quality. And that's one of the challenges, but also a big opportunity. And that's why the work of Kate Orff, who you see here, is so valuable. She's a MacArthur winner. She's been on the faculty here at Columbia way longer than me. I've been here just a year. And her program, which you'll learn about here, is through this visual tour of urban futures in the Rift Valley, is just the kind of thing that's needed. It's active conversation making. It's interrogatory. It's not some Western designer coming in and say, you need a better seawall or the like. So Kate, I'd love it if you could introduce yourself and the conversation that's going to unfold here in these a couple of cities in the eastern part of Africa. And so tell me a little bit about this project, how it works.
Sure. Well, just first of all, thanks, Andy, for having the faculty cohort on and some of the group who traveled to the Great Rift Valley. It's an exciting format that you've innovated with the Earth Institute, and just this notion of communications and merging sort of science, design, communications really is something that's very exciting for all of us. So we're just happy to be part of this. And I'm coming to you live from Queens, New York. So, but I also wanted to say a special shout out to the GSAP students, future students, who I hope are kind of listening along and watching. So welcome, students, if you're coming on live. So yeah, just a little bit about the Columbia Urban Design Program and this particular studio. So we are a post-professional degree program, and I've really kind of tried to focus the study on and the work of the program on issues of climate, issues of justice, and sort of thinking more strategically, not just about the rubric of the city. We are an urban design program, but I do feel like one way that we've tried to push these boundaries is to look more at questions of territory, land, access, all of the water, all of the sort of systems that underpin our built environment, rather than just the unit of the city and how wide the streets are and so on. So what are these really kind of like systemic and foundational questions that can kind of cut at the heart of really getting at what's happening with climate and what's happening with justice issues, and so on. And so every year, of course, this is we're speaking today amidst a kind of a COVID outbreak and pandemic around the globe. But so it feels kind of almost funny to talk about the program that we just completed, because many of the aspects of that program, which was working incredibly closely together, faculties and teams, students in small teams, traveling to very specific areas of the world and interacting very closely with our site partners and mayors and urban managers and so on, seems so out of reach. But I also, it feels nice to just talk about that aspect of it, because it is so important for instruction. So the unit that I teach is the Spring Studio, in which we look at kind of urban climate and social issues in a global scale. We've been doing this for many years, and I'm excited to introduce also some of my co-teachers on the call in just a minute. But background is began this program kind of called Water Urbanism about 5 years ago. So we've traveled to places around the world with this very specific lens about how water can be looked at and how we can approach, very diverse contexts through this lens of water, and to try to literally, not come in with a problem-solving perspective, but really come in with this spirit of discovery, of open inquiry, and to try to understand, in each case, how water is formulating and or kind of underpinning some of the major urban challenges of the day.
There's no way to have a city without water, right?
That's right. And every city, has unique and particular water issues. Just for example, in the past 5 years, we've gone to 4 cities in India alone. In Madurai, in Tamil Nadu region, Varanasi on the Ganges, Pune, and Calcutta. And even just that slice of cities within India have dramatically different issues relative to water. In some cases, sort of erosion and monsoon events that are kind of modern life has sort of disassociated us from these patterns. We had the filling of tanks that had provided water and sustenance for people for many, many years in Madurai and Varanasi. As my co-teacher, Dilip Takuna, will speak probably very eloquently on, the situation with Varanasi and the Ganges is particularly special because you can't deal with Varanasi within its city boundary. You really have to look up to the Himalayas and other places. So that's really what we've done. And then just to shift quickly before I pivot to Dilip, what we did this year, and you can see on your screen, is rather than sort of pair cities, we began to think about this idea of a global transect, north-south, if you will, that really cuts along what is known as the Great Rift Valley. It's actually comprised of about 5 different geological formations, but it sort of cuts, as you see here, through the Jordan River Valley, through Addis, and down to Beira, which is really almost like the delta, if you will, in this amazing system. So it was an opportunity for our students and our faculty to work together in a different way, in a way that's slightly more coordinated, in a way that we can kind of think about this as a transect. So joining today on the call are a couple of really longtime faculty and friends. Just before we were setting up in the green room, it was so great to see each other, because one of the exciting parts of the studio model, and I do feel like, Andy, I want to talk to you about the studio model for the climate school, because it's so fantastic. It's this open discovery-based inquiry where you don't come at a problem with a solution. You're sort of working together. And
well, I wanted to ask you just briefly, when I think of a studio and the arts or even architecture, I think of drawing tables and it's sort of a static place. But so could you define this vision of a studio, and then we'll get into the details?
Sure. I would say that the vision of the studio is a group of people with very different perspectives and experiences working together with a shared sense of purpose around a set of questions. That's the broadest possible way. And what's very important in urban design is that we bring spatial thinking and analytical thinking to that process. But I wanted to introduce Dilip Takuna, who I think is on the line, who could also, one of our longtime co-teachers. Dilip, could you also expand on that studio idea? He's been teaching studios for decades.
Yes, in fact, one of the key words to add, and I think it really addresses the studio milieu, and that is imagination. It is really a room filled with imagination, and I think that aspect, we have really enjoyed at Columbia, through the water urbanism, I would say, segment. Only because we want to see water as more than a material. We see water actually as room for a new imagination. So I would certainly want to add that aspect to our particular studio, because it brings in a certain flavor, I would think. But do you want me to continue, or do you want to introduce the others?
Yeah, maybe. while we're sort of in this intro mode, and I guess before we talk in more detail about the Rift Valley studio, so we have some other co-teachers on the line. I see Thad Pawlowski there. Thad is a sort of a housing disaster recovery expert. Fitza Kelley, who is I would call a resilience thinker and a planner, and Geeta Mehta, longtime faculty as well, who has really advanced the idea of social capital in the studio and sort of women and gender issues. So as you see here, we're sort of all together, but this is literally kind of how it works in the studio, where we have a group of faculty, and I think that's another thing that's sort of special about the way that we run the studio. It's not a kind of a classical atelier model where you have one faculty and 12 students. It's really much more of a, this imaginative brain trust that has a lot of communication. So yeah, and so that this year we were able to look at the Rift Valley with some sort of sense of purpose and fresh thinking. Fitza had worked on the Addis Ababa resilience plan. And of course, Beira, as Thad will discuss later, we were looking at the sort of Beira disaster recovery plan. So I was going to just open up our Andy. I think you might have had it open, but let me open that up, and maybe Dilip, you could talk a little bit about Rift thinking for a minute.
Sure.
So
yeah, Kate's going to open the share slides. Let me just see here. Oh, I see.
Yeah.
If you want, Kate, I can just show what I was showing.
Yeah, let me takes a minute.
Okay, and you don't have to close your screen down to do that.
Okay.
All right, so we'll look at the slides here.
All right.
We'll look at the story map. I mean, not the slides.
Yeah.
So yeah, Dilip, one thing I wanted to get clear is a little bit of a clearer sense on how you chose these particular cities, Beira, Addis, and maybe a little characterization of the issues, because sometimes it's like too much water, it's not enough water, or too much heat in the case of Tel Aviv.
Yeah. Well, that is the case, I think, with all cities in the world. I mean, there's always either too much or too little, because we're so messed up, I think, our infrastructure. But I think I won't get into why these cities were selected. Perhaps Kate can speak to that. But the Rift Valley was was too good, I would say, an opportunity to pass in this regard with respect to these three cities. What conventionally sort of happens is that one tends to look at cities on the Earth's surface, and each of them gather their own forces and are unique in many respects. And urban designers generally approach it as as a unique instance. Each city has a unique instance with their own problems, et cetera, that need to be resolved. But over here, we have this great opportunity, I think, of seeing the Rift Valley as a spine that connects them. And what is amazing about this Rift Valley, and I really think it gets also to the heart of studio thinking, and that is that it is a place of creation, and we would like to see it as a place of creativity as well. I mean, this is a site that the plates, the earth plates are moving apart. I mean, it's rupturing, it's contorting, it's sinking, but it's creating a third space. It's creating a third space between, and this third space has been a wonderful space for civilization, if you will, for nomadic cultures, for waters, basically for emergence. So for us to situate ourselves as designers in the Rift Valley, as opposed to the Earth's surface, is to recognize this amazing potential of the Rift Valley, and to sort of continue to sort of harness its creative forces, as it were. So the third space, I mean, if I could sort of clarify that for a moment, I mean, I think it is, most people would sort of see these plates are just pulling apart, but to recognize that the third place is a kind of a void in between. And this void currently is, of course, filled with waters of various kinds, from pools to aquifers to lakes to to humidity and to basically rainwater and cloud cover. We're looking at this third space as a rich water space, that is gathered a past, but it's also in the future. If you think about it as the future ocean, because this site is going to be occupied by the ocean at some point, and so we see ourselves literally in water, as designers, bringing together or holding together this divergence, incredible divergence that is pulling apart. But I want to extend that, and we sort of build on it as an idea, what it means for designers to appreciate this divergence. Because I think sort of Kate mentioned, that we are not just problem solvers. We are actually trying to resituate many of the issues that we see in cities in a new perspective, with a new imagination and with new imaging that you see in some of these slides. So what
hold on that one, because it's so jarring. I think what's valuable to me, and I think probably to a lot of people come to cities and think of them with a fairly static sense. A city is it is what it is. You think a little bit about the future. And we don't often put in those landscape elements, the deep history. Not that tectonic plate movement is what you have to think about in designing a city, but it conveys this landscape of that normal change is there. It's part of how the city evolves.
Yeah,
and getting used to that.
Yeah.
So this is
absolutely.
So and just to let you know what we're looking at, our students, if you talk about, Andy, and your initiative around communication, every year in the past, we've made these sort of e-books really to get the student work online and to be able to share it. And this year we used a different tool, which is the StoryMap. So I would just say, I'll try to add the link into the chat, and so if you're kind of listening at home, you can check out these story maps, because they're organized with this sort of information at the upper level, and then it sort of goes into some tabs at the top, which talk a little bit in more detail about the sort of investigation of each city and of each place.
I'll add that in a second. I actually made a shortcut so people can easily click to it.
Great. And so uniquely this year as well, as alongside the, our desire to sort of pull sites together in dialogue with each other along this sort of geology of the rift, and to really think about, this longer term future. You can think about, sometimes we have this sort of short-sighted look into what architecture is. What is it in 10 years or 15 years? We're kind of really trying to think about, particularly in light of climate, this very long-term projections for habitability and so on. We also brought two reporters along with us who were also on the call. I don't know if it's a good time to bring them in. I know they're waiting in the wings, but we have Kelley, Lynch, and Vanessa Barchfield here. And so, hey guys.
And this is one of the great, this too, I think, gets at this idea of too often, I think, when we think of the role of a reporter, is something you add on. Hey, let's have a press conference, or here's our report on this city. Come on, reporter, and have a look, as opposed to, this is a process, an emergent process of design. And the process itself can include the media lens, literally. I think that's one of the innovations I really like in what you're trying to do. So maybe Vanessa and Kelley, you could just quickly introduce yourselves in terms of your work. Tucson, Arizona, and where, I can't remember.
Washington
right now.
In DC.
Kelley?
I'm in DC.
So just could you just, maybe you first, and then Vanessa, you could explain how you got looped into this. How did you come along for the ride?
We had a Dale Willman, who is there working with your program as well. I heard about the program that he was doing, where he was bringing journalists on for training in resilience. And I thought, wow, that sounds fantastic and interesting. And so I joined his resilience program. That was in October. And he said, hey, would you be interested in possibly going along with these guys from Colombia to Ethiopia, which is, I lived there for 4 years. So that was kind of like going home, which was great. And then I went on to Beira with them as well. So, and I do a lot of work in development. So it was kind of an opportunity to expand my skills and to kind of learn about something entirely new.
And Vanessa, your background is in radio and the like. So again, were you looped in the same way? Did you have this thirst for resilience?
Yes. So I'm actually a science and environment reporter and producer at Arizona Public Media, which is the NPR and PBS station in Tucson, Arizona, throughout southern Arizona. And so I've been, my work over the last few years has been almost exclusively about the water issues that we're facing here, and also, biodiversity issues, a lot of work on climate change. And so I attended also Dale Willman's resilience journalism program about a year ago in the Adirondacks. It was lovely. And also, I've traveled a lot and spent a lot of time all over the world, and had always really wanted to go to Ethiopia. And so when I heard that was on the agenda, I leapt up at the opportunity, and was hoping to actually write pitch some articles about the program. Of course, COVID sort of upended everything, but it was an amazing week to spend in Addis Ababa. And with one thing that was just so wonderful for me was being there with a group of designers, because I got to see the city in this entirely different way. I mean, it was a fascinating look at a remarkable place.
That's very cool. So Kate, back to you, and maybe you can build in some of the conversation from your colleagues on some of the specific points as we work through the map. I'll click back to the.
Yeah, I thought we could take this chance to maybe go in a little bit deeper to the site in Addis that Kelley mentioned, and I have our story map open, and I guess I would just like to ask Fitza and Gita to maybe chime in, because I think of course we're talking in a conceptual way about climate and global scale issues, but every time when we're traveling and there's this incredible where the fine grain these issues hit the ground and impact people's lives in very, very specific ways. So Fitza, I would leave it to you if you would like to share your screen and look at a PowerPoint, or if you want me to just scroll through the story.
Yeah, I think
map.
Scrolling through the story map is fine. All right.
Okay. Great.
Right.
So let's go to about the studio, and then I'll go on mute here. Mm-hmm.
Addis Ababa, as you all know, is one of the most rapidly urbanizing cities in the whole of Africa. But the way that the urbanization pattern has happened over the last year has completely neglected this vein-like network of seasonal rivers that the city has, and choked them in a way, and has relegated them to the backyards of people's homes, and most people use them as garbage disposal sites and sewers, rather than recreational sites, or using them for their ecological value. And so there we have a series of a network of extremely polluted rivers across the city, and we had very limited engagement with them throughout the years, even though initially when the city settled, it was actually settled around them. And it was very surprising even for me to see pictures from the early 1900s of where the river was flowing, and I was like, I did not know that we had so much water in the city, because you barely see them. And the engagement the city has had with it is usually like just building retainer walls in the winter seasons, because that's when everyone remembers the rivers, because they flood a lot. But aside from that, it was very limited interaction. But in 2018, when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power, he was doing a lot of sweeping liberal interventions throughout the country. And one of the legacy projects that he wanted to work on is revitalizing this network of rivers. And so there's this whole new plan called the Beautifying Shaggar Project that really wants to leverage the aesthetic value of these rivers across the city, and use them mainly as a tourist site, but also as job creation opportunities and increasing green space. And this is a great opportunity, right? Because again, something that has been ignored for over a century is now going to be a central part of urban design for the city. But at the same time, there have been critiques of this project because it has a lot of it's very luxury centric, and it's not. It's been criticized for displacement issues, for instance. For instance, in the image that's on the screen, which is a CBD of Addis, that's where the first pilot project is happening, which is funded by the Chinese government and constructed by a Chinese construction company as well. And that has displaced about thousands of households. So the question of who's this project for, has been rising, and this is a pattern throughout the city that has been happening. Of as you can see from here, a lot of the old kabele houses, public houses in the city, have been demolished, and people have been displaced out into the peripheries of the city, while high rises and roads and whatnot have completely changed the pattern of the city. So this Beautifying Shaggar project is still is going along those lines as well. So that's why this opportunity of, on the one hand, the recognition and to work with these rivers, but also the critiques that were coming along it, made it an interesting place to have a studio for us. And so we traveled there to see what we can do and what other options of revitalization could be available for the city that are inclusive, both in regards of inclusive for the people around living around those areas, but also for the biodiversity that is around the rivers that we saw when we were doing our study tours.
I wanted to ask a question, and perhaps Thad or Dilip could add some perspective too. How frequent is it when you do a studio in a city that the design questions are more about policy design than landscape design? In other words, those issues you're talking about, where the money is coming from China, where the politics are in a certain direction, you realize that a design that's inclusive and resilient might not be feasible without policy design. So I don't know, Dilip and Thad, maybe, and also you, is that like the norm, that's the design that needs to happen?
Well,
Dilip, you're muted.
Yeah, Geeta might want to chime in on this too, because she was with us, Addis, and had some great perspective on the city's role in shaping the urban environment.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Thad. Yes, I think it was the first thing that really struck us was that the government was right now moving as fast as possible with these projects, which were really calculated in terms only of financial capital. And I think one of the things our studio really brought to the fore was that social capital and ecological capital are equally important. Actually, I was blown away with the social capital of people who live in kabeles, who are now kabele housing, who are now being pushed into these condominiums in the outskirts. But these people had their communities, they supported each other, and they helped each other, and they had their livelihoods inside the city, because the government had long time ago been very smart in providing them temporary tenure on public land inside the city. I think the whole world should be learning from that. But right now, they are being pushed out, and it was like devastating the social capital and ecological capital, talking about water. That was really not so evident in any of the policy thinking. It was all about economic development and pouring as much concrete as you can. So our studio was about the resilience accelerator, but I think it was also there to accelerate some kind of fresh thinking and mental reset about what ecological capital can be and how important that is, as well as social capital. So I think that, yes, the policies were right now not so holistic, but if we made any contribution and in talking to the local governments and people and all stakeholders, is that to say that stop pouring concrete and really, nurture your tremendous ecological capital and social capital that you have. So yes, it has to start at the policy, but so much push is needed for that.
If I can add something very quickly, I mean, I think that in the current environment in particular, I mean, some of the issues that are being raised, for example, even in the Green New Deal and things like that, in the context of this country, have been raised in these parts of the world for the last 60, 70 years. And we are often up against some of the issues. I mean, Kate mentioned some of the studios that we've done in India. I mean, and it's incredible, actually, the kind of obstacles that we face. They're all policy. I mean, they all come from a certain imaging of the future that is driven by development aspirations that are totally wrong-headed, And so we see this, we see design as an opportunity, actually, for addressing this entire, I would say, edifice, of development agenda, civilizational mindset. I mean, even racism, I think, to a large extent, casteism and so on, all the way down. It's something that we have to constantly deal with when working with design here.
Yeah, and also the power of design is, for instance, in the case of Addis, if you see these videos of what this project would be, people are so taken by them because they have this view of what a world-class, like a typical world-class city is. And in the ways, like one of the things we also try to do in order to, also start a conversation around this policy changes is present another image, another aesthetic that is also, like pleasing in a way, but has these ecological and social capitals at its center. So another vision. So that was one of the things we tried to do as well.
Yeah, I want to bring Kate back into. Hold on, I'm going to switch here for a second and get Kate back in the mix.
Yeah.
We had a computer issue.
Yeah,
technology is our friend.
The loading the story map was a bridge too far for my wireless.
So here, but there's, I think one of the resonant lessons here still is that you're talking about part of the studio is sort of designing conversations as well. We were saying while you were off, that the if it's just concrete and money, it's not going to shape things in a way that will lead to some of the outcomes you guys look for. So,
and it's
what
so
were those
much
conversations like.
Well, it's also so much tied into just the market economy and the kind of profit margin around person who's selling concrete. I mean, that's one thing we learned in Pune, India, if you recall that. But these images that you see on your screen here, Fitz, I don't know if you talked about with EIABC, well, you talk about designing conversations. I mean, a lot of the work that, obviously this is an educational endeavor, and but so much of the kind of rewarding aspect comes from just generating a dialogue that exists as a kind of a counter narrative or a different, fresh look to the sort of received idea. So here you can see on your slide, Professor Aziz and some others as we kind of traveled with EIAB students along the length of the sort of river network. And then Fitza, have you shown any projects at all? That might be before we transition over to the Beira site. It might just be interesting to talk about like some of the design principles or just show a couple of proposals, because I just wanted to emphasize the spatial imagination aspect. We're not the outcome, unlike say maybe Vanessa, who might be doing an NPR story or a radio story. What we try to do is take this diverse input from working with other students, working with other faculty, and to try to sort of translate that. And I think this is the what would you call it? I was going to, because I have 2 young kids, I like superpowers. These are the superpowers of the designers, which are like translating that into kind of a spatial concept and breaking that down into manageable chunks of action. So a lot of what our studio has been doing over the years is to try to, offer a kind of a counter to what is kind of seen as like a site-based master planning approach where there's just site by site. So Fitz, do you want to talk about this slide a little bit? Because this is how we basically organized our students on the site. And then maybe we can just show 1 or 2 projects before we transition over to the Delta, the Beira context.
Yeah, so one of the things we did when we were on the ground in Addis is visit a handful of sites along the Beautifying Sugar project path. And so as you can see from here, we started from the Ntoto Mountains and made our way all the way down to the Akaki lowlands. And all the sites, we visited 5 sites, and all the sites you can see had their own very unique characteristics that a monotonic infrastructure project could just not respond to. So we interacted, for instance, with Kachani, which has like an artisanal community and has a lot of water issues where source of the pollution is like a bit north of the waters, is a bit north of the area here, and Piazza, which is the old part of Addis, where they're like really super active streets, but at the same time where the river is, there's a gorge, is completely neglected, and it's in fact dividing communities. Addis and the Ambassador in the CBD, which has a huge biodiversity, and Peacock Park, which has an agricultural cooperative that has been around for decades, and the Akaki lowlands, where we have a lot of groundwater, which is currently being overexploited. And so we have these different types of spaces, and what we did there was we paired, like our responses was to pair community stewardship with water plans, and these community stewardships, relied on existing structures of, like Gita was saying, community structures and the co-op structure that is very familiar within Addis. Instead of doing this like whole master plan type of planning, we wanted to look through and see what community structures can give us in these different sites. So some of the responses we did, for instance, in Piazza, is to use again like these streets to stitch back together two different communities. One, a Kabali housing community on one side of the gorge, and another a new condominium community that is completely disconnected, and use streets and water programs to bring in the commerce and bring in the life into this gorge, and make it more accessible through creating a series of co-ops. And in Ambassador, which is the CBD of the city, where there's a lot of construction happening. There's going to be a new gated community project that's going to happen there, funded by UAE and whatnot. And there's a lot of displacement happening. And there's a lot of there's even like a hot spring there, and wetlands that currently are very neglected. So what we try to do is see how we can leverage social and ecological capital in the city center to keep people there and have it be part of their development and the revitalization of the rivers. So, and again, like as we went down from north to south across the city, what we tried to do is use elements that are already existing there with, and elevate them to be more, to focus more on social.
Maybe we could just click on this one. I mean, there's just this one example of a type of project, which I think, and I think to the point about developing an alternative way of, we were really trying to pair these existing sort of community structures with river restoration, revitalization efforts. So this was one, for example, that was a sort of a fragment of an agricultural land that was being managed and stewarded by an existing co-op. And so part of this students group was to sort of investigate this co-op and try to understand how it could provide a different model for river and water management, but that is very different than putting it in a concrete canal.
Right.
So, let's see, Dilip, or do you want to talk about this, or what was that, Andy? Go ahead.
Well, quick question: how integral to the way you go at this now is this storytelling tool, StoryMaps? I wrote the obituary for Ian McHarg back in 2001, and I learned a lot about his pioneering use of Mylar, overlays, and selling a city council on some new design. And here you're able to add so many elements like that. And I wouldn't mind hearing from Kelley and Vanessa too, as a journalist. When you think about the tools we now have, are we just in baby steps? And even I'm admiring deeply that it's the depth as well as just the visual quality of what you're looking at here seems to me still so exciting compared to a New York Times article.
Yeah, if I could jump in there, I mean, that was really one of the big takeaways for me was their process. I mean, we think about, design over here and journalism over here, but what they're doing, what the students were doing, under the direction of the faculty, are telling stories, and they were using the exact same tools that I use as a journalist. They did the research before they got there. Formed a narrative, sort of hypothesis, and then they went into the field and, interviewed all of the stakeholders, interviewed people who live there, who are affected by, the floods when they happen or the drought when that occurs. And as Dilip said, the word imagination, I mean, they're really like imagining what could be in this place using the essential tools of storytelling, and then of course design as well, skills that I don't have. But to me, it was this sort of radical idea or radical sort of form of like solutions journalism in a way, solutions storytelling. It was super, just inspiring to watch that process.
Well, I think what we're seeing here is convergence, basically convergence, which is a word that, it's in a lot of grants now, convergence, NSF grants, but it's a real thing. Journalism and design and scholarship and data fields are really converging on ways. I think the thirst that you see in this whole concept of solutions journalism itself is a torquing toward this direction of listening, but not just to get a quote. Listening to capture dimensions of a problem and the like. Geeta, you were going to say something. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say that the unique skill we all bring to the table, you were talking about policy, the unique skill is to imagine what the future might look like, what an alternative might look like, and be able to visually present that so it's very easily understandable. And, for example, Kate was talking about the urban agriculture thing. You cannot really do ecological healing in a city without really bringing in the people, without community stewardship, right? So it very much has to be a partnership, and you have to think about it, but you also have to show how that might, look like. Similarly, in any of the areas we worked in, like how can you design housing without thinking about livelihoods? It makes no sense, right? You can't put people in any kind of a condominium just in the outskirts and hope they will live happily ever after. They won't if they don't have jobs. So to think of all these things, but then be able to present them in very visual form, that's what we kind of bring to the table.
That's so interesting. So Kate, I'll get back to the slides now so you can, we can walk through this a little bit more, this example, and get to Mozambique. Hold on one second.
I was just thinking maybe we could scroll a little bit more through the Peacock Park and then transition. But it is, to your point about the story map, it is what was exciting to us being very spatial thinkers is that it does enable you to scale. And I think that's another kind of tool of the studio, which is that we're working at multiple scales. We're trying to think, our first exercise was really about drawing the rift and exploring the Rift Valley and looking at human migration patterns or forced migration, which were, looking at bird migration, looking at water bodies, looking at many, many different factors that sort of exist or coexist along this line. But then, you get down from the scale of the Great Rift sort of series of water bodies to this one segment of the river that you're looking at here. And, it's super instructive. So I think this concept of scaling is another way that you can learn efficacy, right? Like, frankly, the problems and challenges are so overwhelming, but you can kind of understand them at a certain scale. But still, a lot of what I try to teach in the studio is like defining the scale of efficacy, right? Like, how can we make a change in this situation? Because we really try to resist. It's what sometimes happens in architecture or culture, which is just like fancy renderings go out on the web, and then they look like some a version of Mars, So, but the students here, we really try to train them on scalar thinking, and so that was as Fitza mentioned, we were looking at the scale of the co-op here, because this is a large group of people already working together in a really coordinated way. So part of it was just being able to meld the scale of the river revitalization project with the scale of that kind of social unit. So it's another just principle that comes up over and over again as we try to take on some of these challenges.
There's so many questions. Luckily, we do have some time. We're going to go through till about 45 minutes, if that's okay with everybody.
Great.
I keep having questions though, and I assume I'd like to save this for the end, but I'll pose it just now, but we don't have to answer it, which is the sustainability of this model. In other words, community integration in the region, in the city, of the vision you lay out here. How does that get sustained once you move on next year to another set of cities? Or the continuity there is a really important thing, but we'll get to that. Do we want to switch to Beira?
Yeah. Thad, do you want to share your screen? And I guess sort of zooming back out to just the rift scale. Of course, Beira had an incredible, in terms of thinking about resilience, whether or not you want to use that word, if it's overused or underused, but Beira had an incredible challenge of being hit by Cyclone Idai. Right. So it's a unique situation in which we were trying to, there is, this kind of like disaster capitalism model that has been described by Naomi Klein and others. And I think in this case, we were trying to go to this place with not a sort of like, hey, if you could only import the Dutch model, it would be great. Or if you would just listen to us about this one thing, it would be great. But really just to try to understand the physical landscape, the geomorphology, how people lived, and to truly sort of posit a different context for thinking about resilience in this case. So Thad, do you want to?
Sure. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, it's on. Can you see it? Yeah. We're looking at at your screen.
Okay, and you see video footage. One of our students brought a drone so we could see the landscape around Beira. Beira is a city of about 500,000 people in central Mozambique. It's at the base of the Great Rift Valley, or where this vast network of water flows out into the Straits of Madagascar. There's the Zambezi River, which is one of the great rivers of Africa, and along with the Pungwe River and several other rivers, it drains the highlands that separate Mozambique from Zimbabwe and the other inland countries. And so it's a very watery place. It's had centuries and centuries of really fertile agriculture and fishing. And it's also the crossroads of all of these cultures. So Beira's economy today is really about being one of the major ports of Africa, and a lot of the goods that go into Zimbabwe and Zambia come through Beira, but also a lot of the coal and natural gas that is being more and more developed in Mozambique is exported through this port. And then last year, this is a map of Portuguese settlement in Beira. They developed this patch of high ground, like on a sand dune at the mouth of this river, as a port in the age of Portuguese colonial rule. And then this of course happened last spring. The most destructive cyclone on record in the Indian Ocean crashed right into the area around Beira. And then a few months later, a second cyclone, Kenneth, landed north. During the first cyclone, Idai, from space, it looked as if central Mozambique had become a vast inland lake. This whole territory was flooded. And in the city of Beira, it's estimated that about 90% of the structures were damaged. Very powerful winds ripped off all the zinc roofs from all of these cinder block houses. And the infrastructure was also badly damaged. The infrastructure, a lot of the more formal infrastructure is concentrated on this higher ground, which is in the coastal area on the dune. But most of the people live in the back dune, in the lowland areas that have rapidly grown really over the last 30 years. And there's a complex set of reasons for the rapid urbanization of Beira and lots of other African cities, but in part it's due to the civil war that happened in Mozambique after the Portuguese independence from Portugal. But this is the long-term vision that some Dutch resilience engineers have proposed for Beira. It's more of an expansion into this floodplain, and this sort of Euclidean zoning. If you're a city planner, it's this sort of separation of all these different uses. So we came there with Professor Anselmo Cani, who is professor of architecture at Eduardo Mondlane University, and he's been asked by one of his former students, who's at the UN Habitat working on recovery, to come and give technical assistance to the city. And this is the mayor of Beira, and we were there to talk with the recovery cabinet, a group of government officials, and this is Denise, who is from UN Habitat. And he is leading how the recovery technical assistance flows from these big UN agencies like UN Habitat and other international aid organizations into plans that the city can use. So, but probably the most satisfying part of all of this work was the engagement between our students and the Mozambican students, who worked really intensively together for a week. We went on site visits together. This is the professor, Betsy, and we were able to use our imaginations together to think about futures for Beira. And so we went on, we saw recovery in action. This is a IOM camp set up outside of town that we visited and saw people rebuilding together. Some of these photos were done by Kelley, who was along to give us great photographic and documentation, and really a great perspective on what we were seeing. It's really helpful to go to these places with a lot of different sets of eyes so we can all sort of process together. And then through the week, we developed design principles when you're looking at how to take all of this imaginative energy and place it on the ground. It's really helpful to start with principles. So central principle for Beira, we think, is that Mozambique, all of coastal Mozambique, but particularly this place, has really rich natural capital. It's this confluence of fresh water from the Pungwe River and the coastal waters from the Straits of Mozambique. So it's incredible fisheries, but also wetlands and other kinds of habitats. So how to build on that natural capital, how to make infrastructure serve multiple purposes, and build from the intrinsic resilience of the communities that have lived through not just these last two cyclones, but decades of war and other kinds of social and environmental disruption. And yeah, sorry.
One of the questions that comes to mind always in situations like this is when, especially in poor places, when recovery is the key question after a disaster. How do you plan? How do you build in the planning discussion even in that discussion? And anyone who wants to chime in, Dilip or others, but Thad, what's your thinking about the lessons there?
Yeah, recovery is really, I think, a complex conversation because Kate alluded to this disaster capitalism. There are very few good models for how institutions like governments or NGOs come to the recovery conversation. And so our students, along with the Mozambican students, tried to explore who can be responsible for recovery and try to challenge the status quo of recovery. And so we talked about whether business could play a bigger role. And one group looked at the port and how the port could support more holistic recovery or really resilience. We also looked at small community-based infrastructure like schools and health clinics, whether they could play a bigger role in the recovery. We also looked at how NGOs that are focused on nature, like the World Wildlife Fund, could be a bigger part of the recovery. But this one was how community-based agriculture could play a bigger role in the recovery. Maybe, Dilip, could I ask you to jump in here and talk about one of the...
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I mean, these two projects, actually, this one and the next. But I wanted to actually put the word recovery in a larger context in Beira. These are people who have been, when they were recovering from colonialism, got into a civil war. When they were recovering from a civil war, they got into, cyclones, and cyclone after cyclone. So, this is the word recovery here is something that has to be sort of extended. And I think it is true for much of Africa and like you say, Andy, for much of the so-called developing world. I think that we have to do something to break this cycle of constant, perpetual disaster recovery, colonialism recovery, and we see so much of it over here. But this particular project, sort of built on the idea of the Machamba, which is of course often described as an agricultural garden. But what students did was actually to take it out of this notion of just being a static entity and used it systemically to sort of expanding it into an infrastructure that would break this economy of recovery and put people onto their into a sort of long-term economies that would be more resilient. So this was one idea that was sort of developed and sort of extended from a more conventional take on it to something new, I think, given in the environment of the studio, which I think is also touches on another aspect that you were bringing up with the story map. And I think that most of these projects are non-linear in the sense that they draw on multiple narratives. So to some extent, the story map is also sort of inadequate to the design process in some respects, but it comes close. I think it goes further than the McCargan layer cake method for sure. And so you'll see in these projects actually the way in which students are working, that it is about, yes, it touches on infrastructure, it touches on agriculture, it touches on economy, it touches on gender issues. They're dealing with a multiplicity of concerns. But that maybe the next project really touches on recovery. The one that the ABC project actually, this one was really about dealing with taking an instance of discovery of recovery and working materially to construct a self-reliant economy that would build, in the future, a sustainable, let's say, a sustainable or a more resilient community that would be lasting. And so they really focused on developing materially, locally, regionally, and so the economy was not just developing in Beira; it was developing around Beira in the region and in the country. And so that is sort of one way of getting beyond this this disaster recovery kind of treadmill. Thad, if you want to add something more to that, and
no, I think that I absolutely agree, and this project and all the other projects taught us something, gave us a new lens for critiquing the disaster recovery machinery. And Kelley, I'd love to hear, since you were there with us too, if you want to talk about the process that you observed of us learning together.
Well, I think the most, for me, at both sites, it was a fascinating thing to have this this kind of right there every morning teaching, and then to be going to these different places and going with people who are so well versed and bring such different lenses to everything. Dilip, we would always talk about water, and he would question the meaning of different words all the time. I came to be, I went on to Bangladesh after traveling to Beira, and every time I was doing a piece on informal settlements, and every time I said that word, I thought, oh my God, don't say that word, because that Dilip doesn't like that word. So there was all of this deconstruction all the time, and I think that was,
we can't say flooding either. So
no.
There's a whole list, Kelley. We'll talk after.
We should do another session just on that, the language.
Amazing for you on this, but yeah, looking at it through Gita's, much more social justice lens, and then through Kate's, what is the landscape and how is all of this working together? And then Thad has the disaster and the recovery piece from his work in New York. It was like a masterclass for me personally. I mean, sometimes I really feel like I probably did not bring near as much as what I received from all of this. And I think the most important thing for me was what I've taken away from it, and how this allows me to go. I mean, my career may be entirely changed going forward, because it used to be on a plane going to different countries doing work for different development organizations, by and large. But it certainly brought a larger perspective to everything that I've done since. And
that's, I just want to briefly note that that's one of the reasons we are building Dale Willman's Center at Columbia, because it's clear to me that just exposure, sustained exposure among practitioners, scholars, and the like, ideally in the field, but right now even online, I think can build new frontiers.
Absolutely.
I want to add something. I just want to, Kate talks about disaster capitalism. And I just want to touch on that, because, when Idai came and these disasters come, or now COVID we are all dealing with, I think it becomes quite evident that government cannot abdicate its role to the private industry and say, okay, this is like the capitalist model, so you go do it. No, the governments have to really be the keepers of public good, and then energize the people to become custodians, of redevelopment, of recovery, and environmental stewardship. And I think these disasters really bring that very, very strongly to the fore. And you talked about policy earlier on. So yes, policy, and then, as Kate mentioned, multi-scalar response, which includes in a very large way the people. I think that's the key.
Sounds great. Maybe we can go back to, hold on, I'll pull the slides back up to just sustain that visual part of the conversation. Oh, Thad, did you close your?
Oh, yeah. Would you like me to share?
Well, if you, it was working well. Although I guess
Okay,
you can't see the screen with our faces when you were doing it, but it was working
That's all
very
right.
well. Kate, do you have any other interim thoughts here, just at this point in the conversation before we?
Well, no, I mean, I guess one of the things that just is coming out of this conversation is also, the methodology. I think you can kind of see here how we're sort of trying to all build on each other's thought processes. I do think that is something that is important and different in terms of learning, right? Because having taught with this group for a long time, it's just like incredible respect and affection that sort of comes out of this thesis. Kelley used the word master class. I mean, I could say the same thing, even just teaching with this group for a long time. It's a different model of learning, I think, that is very rewarding for the instructors as well. I don't know if that's but it's rewarding for all of us, because I can always kind of think, okay, well, there's a piece of this that I'm just not getting to, and Gita will mention something about social capital credits or another mode of economic acting that isn't even in the picture. So I can't quite wrap my words around it now, but it's a model of teaching and learning that sort of builds and it moves forward. So I always have this feeling of never being stuck, if you will, because I have a colleague to my left and my right, and we were able to sort of move our way through the moment and through some of the issues in a way that's very positive, in a way that's very generative. So, I'm pivoting a little bit, Andy, to the climate school. President Bollinger announced a climate school at Columbia, and I am so interested in working with Alex Halliday and Lee Bollinger on just basically setting from the beginning the essentially a framework of learning when we're talking about the climate school that does have this more sort of context of sharing and collaboration and moving forward. I do feel like we start to fall down when we just talk about, we'll just get an engineering solution over here, and then we're going to do policy there. And one of the challenges is obviously to kind of maintain a holistic approach, but also develop an actionable pathway for moving forward. So I'm super interested in just I suppose watching the space and kind of understanding how that pedagogy will evolve, because it does seem to me that we're talking about the urban design program and the School of Architecture, but in another way, we're just talking about, studying the challenges of the world through this particular lens. So it's quite fascinating. Oh, I see you've got your Twitter page. I don't know if you wanted to respond to that.
Well, I wanted to bring up this point that, again, any climate school that will be of service to humanity really has two main components: the mitigation of emissions side and the mitigation of impact side. In other words, how do you build resilience in communities now while we work toward a decarbonized economy and the like? And those are all multidisciplinary, all inclusive, all interrogatory, all community engaging processes. Next June, there's a big meeting being planned on managed retreat. It's the second one that Columbia did. And I think that is such a great design opportunity. Having a studio process right now leading up to next June, or as soon as we can, as it relates to the academic cycle, but also just generally online. Even getting back to words, managed retreat to me sucks as a name for something, but it's something we have to figure out, and not just on coasts. It's wet wildfire regions, areas where we've overbuilt in zones of hazard. Getting these conversations going now is implicitly, Kate, you and I agree, of course, totally, on that networked approach to that. And I think everything I've heard about the climate school concept at Columbia is about integrating the schools, including like the School of Social Work, which isn't something that you normally think of in terms of climate change. But I'll tell you, there are great people there working on it. So let's get back to our conversation on your studio projects. But I'm really glad you raised that point about where the opportunities we have right now at Columbia to get at this. So I'm going to go back to Thad's slides.
Yeah, because in a way, I think the notion of a format that is gathering, is what's going to be so transformational for Columbia if we can do it.
And communities too. That's the whole the line between Columbia and the community is a blurring one and should be more and more blurred, I think. I wanted to bring up one thing that came in a comment. There was a question.
Yeah.
That came in.
Yeah.
And the question below, you'll see Ashok Kumar.
Exactly. This is the fourth purpose of the.
He asked about COVID-19. Any architectural?
The fourth purpose of the university. Mm-hmm.
Whoop, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
And
sure.
Do you see on the screen I added from LinkedIn, Ashok was asking about COVID-19. And I know that your projects all took place before lockdown, but we're in a moment now going forward where even the prospect of doing a studio will have to be more digital for the time being, more connecting with partners and stakeholders on the ground, perhaps the way we're connecting right now. And I don't know if you're already thinking forward toward even normalizing this process, making the studio process something that any community can start to explore. Is there a template or a way to think of this in the online environment that's kind of been imposed on us for the moment by COVID-19?
Well, I might just offer a thought that, one thing, there's so much to be learning right now at this moment. And one thing is the importance of the local, of really focusing close to our communities. And, we were on the other side of the world with this and making partnerships, which is an incredible learning opportunity on all sides. But I think one thing, with the climate school and with our future work, emphasizing that to bring people together to talk about these existential problems of climate change and rapacious global capitalism and pandemics, we really need to focus on local communities, try to get as close to the ground as possible. And I think that's what the studio model really offers. But it's also a way to bring different disciplines together, that you by connecting more with a place, you break down these silos that so often generate the mono thinking that creates so much of the fragility in our world. The urban development approach that just looks at economic development as the answer, or the the engineering approach that just looks at more infrastructure as the answer. Or even the conservationist approach that just looks like at protecting nature. All of these in themselves are insufficient to really answer the interconnected risk of climate, urbanization, and globalization. And so staying local is really the primary object of the studio work, I think.
And that feels like an opportunity again for a template approach. I know it's the skill sets and experience of everybody on this call that makes the driving design process go forward. But one thing I've been thinking about a lot is what we can do to facilitate resilience thinking and planning in communities with some mediation and some expertise. The Consensus Institute that was at our managed retreat meeting has the skill set for driving constructive conversation. There's this out in the West, there's a planningforwildfire.org, which is a very small, underutilized project offering communities a sort of a template for how to live with wildfire, as we figure out the climate problem. And I think maybe it would be great for us to think before the end of the call about some next steps we could do to explore that option. One thing I mentioned in a comment here, let me see if I can put it back up, was Arizona State has this long-standing model of a decision theater. So to me, like having your studio and then integrating that with a decision theater, which is a technological space for looking at data, so decision makers and communities can sit in a room or online and hash out futures and have that mediated experience. It feels like a new element maybe to bring in. I don't know if that feels like it makes sense.
I want to say that I'm just so excited.
Yeah, I think I see Gita. Go ahead.
While there's so much wrong about being always online in COVID, I think it's such a huge opportunity for our studio, for example, to work much more closely with the local communities we work with. And like you said, that involve many more people than would have been possible. So this is like a new dimension that's coming up, which is like super exciting for as we go forward in developing these modules, developing these templates, but also being able to work, directly with people online. So I think this is a very, very exciting time for them.
There's much to work on. I want to actually show the screen again. So
sure.
Whoops.
I'll stop sharing.
I was just gonna. There was a comment in the chat, Andy, about COVID, and I just wanted to sort of say on almost like on a separate note, at Columbia we have a center called the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes, and one of the ways that we've begun to sort of pivot around. I don't know, maybe Thad, you could bring that up, the pivot towards a kind of a much sort of a more local approach is to begin to kind of, there it is, crcl.columbia.edu, is to sort of begin to look in a much more local way in our immediate kind of environs. So we're looking at working with React in Harlem and trying to really use our design and planning skills as a sort of almost like to provide technical assistance to very groups struggling with this in our immediate environs. And so the question was framed around like, is there an architectural solution to COVID? I think the answer is no. In fact, much of our what we would even call green architecture has created interiorized environments reliant on complex MEP systems with non-operable windows, et cetera, et cetera. So, I guess one way that Columbia is actively working in the COVID space is through the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes, and in this very, very local way, and to try to look at streets and to try to reimagine streets as sort of green corridors and ways that streets could actually, kind of serve as multi-purpose infrastructure for more than just like car storage and et cetera. So if you click visit the site on the top right, that should bring you to the correct site. Thad, did you want to add anything there?
Sure. And also the decision theater is very intriguing as well. I mean, it's akin to the work that we've been doing at the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes. We do a lot of scenario planning. I think is a very important tool for thinking about climate change and the future of cities. So, in fact, in Mozambique, we started with a scenario planning around natural gas extraction. But this scenario planning is a really important tool to democratize the conversation about city planning and climate change adaptation and disaster recovery, in a way to disclose the forces that shape the urban environment and that change the world, and really question them in in a constructed conversation that, you know, is premised on what we've seen in other environments. So when we went to do scenario planning around natural gas extraction in Mozambique, we looked at other places in Africa and Angola and the Niger River Delta and other places and said, these are the patterns of urbanization that we see in extraction landscapes, and what can we learn from this, and how can we redirect in this way? So yeah, this is our annual report that has some of the work in it.
Yeah, and maybe that gets to this concept of this story map idea, having a mapped city with those elements that are there, but have it more dynamic and updatable and with community input. There is a website, there's a web tool that just came to mind. It was developed by an American journalist who actually was at the journalism school, Anjali Nayar, created timby.org. It's thisismybackyard.org, Timby, Timby. And it's still nascent, but it has some of the qualities you were just describing, where the community could, sorry about the truck, the community could generate data. Think about Beira map or the like in the context of the story map version of Urban Futures, but where you have community integrated conversations and reporting. She's kind of trying to work on this model. It grew out of a documentary she did on Liberian deforestation, but I think that's another element that might be applicable, or we could, if we do another session of this going forward, and I like to think of these as iterative conversations. This is an introductory one that sprawled and showed a beautiful picture of a great way to learn as a studio, and with journalistic input and with a sense of a frontier. And the threat landscape, of course, is changing too, as we've all seen. COVID-19 on top of cyclone risk, on top of heat waves. Building forward, it feels like I can already identify a set of partners or others to have in a conversation. The one thing we didn't mention yet, and maybe I'll throw this at you, we have about 8 more minutes, is whether this can be integrated into secondary or even primary school education. Like in Teachers College, their sustainability crew, looking at your story map, I guarantee you, or Cassie Shu at Earths Institute, they would see a learning moment there. And that's another arena where incorporating data is so important. And think about that in the context of, we're all screen bound, right? Probably into the fall, who knows for how long. And teachers, and I know many who are freaked out about how to engage their students. This is at the secondary level. If they had an ability to map their own future, to look at their own community, to say, wow, here are the wetlands, here's the flood pattern, here's the poverty. Building on this model you've created here feels like a great opportunity. So education, journalism, as Vanessa and Kelley have shown, can have some more integral part of this conversation. Peter Coleman, our difficult conversations laboratory folks.
Right.
You know, we're all sort of pushing toward, in a convergent way, a new model for data and community needs with transparency. You know, China money is just one example of the pressures in these regions, including our own regions, toward models for development that might not be optimal for everyone, race, etc. So I'm really excited. If we could just go around the room one more time. I'm going to mute myself because there's a truck about to pump our septic tank. We live in an antiquated village in the Hudson Valley with no sewer system. We have our own future to map. So I'm gonna mute myself. And Kate, if you could drive just a final round of a few minutes of conversation. Who should be in the room, and what's the next step like within a month or two?
So, I mean, maybe we could talk a little bit about, you know, Fitza, we began to present some of the ideas in a very public context. And, you know, I guess I definitely feel like part of the power of academia is that we have, you know, the space to think about alternative futures and, you know, not to just sort of follow the path of least resistance of a dollar comes in, spend the dollar here, you know. So I guess one thing maybe Fitza and Gita could speak to a little bit is just our recent sort of conversations with the city, and in so many ways, I feel like Gita speaks to this notion of like cities that empower, and I maybe we could, the two of you could speak a little bit more in the Addis context about how the goal of our plan was to empower, and what kind of an audience that we've had more recently.
Yeah, so one of the greatest things about what we did in Addis for me was that because we had the time and we had the interest, we were going around different sites and we were talking to people. So we had this opportunity, one, the interest and the time, but two, the fact that we are from academia and we're not as threatening as people who are from the government, to actually hear what people felt and needed and how they responded to these recent development projects. And I think that the story map and all the work we've done, we've tried to shape it around this, and we try to engage many local thinkers that have been thinking about this for a long time, way more time than we have, and listen and learn from them. And recently we had the opportunity to present these ideas to part of the city administration that is working on this beautifying Shankar project. And to my surprise, it also resonated there, and the opportunities to work together are opening up. And that's the value of like what we bring as listeners and interpreters of what's on the ground, but also the design, the renderings we had, the imagination that we bring to the table could show the different version of what these rivers could look like, because a lot of people were already taken by the renderings and these fancy, videos that were coming out of the Beautifying Shankar project. And Gita, if you want to add more.
Yeah, I just want to add that the highlight for me in when we were in Addis was the last presentation we made in the Urban Design Forum in the heart of the city, with more like 120 people showing up. And it went on for 2 hours, but it could have actually gone on for 10 hours. There was so much energy and ideas just flowing in the room. And I'm just so excited to think that we can now leverage technology to let that conversation go for 10 hours, for 20 hours, for a much longer time. So I'm just looking forward to, in our studio, to harness this new, cyberspace we have all been trust with, but we are enjoying. So for me, that's like the next thing that I'm so super excited about.
Great. Maybe, let's see, Kelley or Vanessa, do you guys want to chime in with some words of wisdom for us, or your thoughts on
I guess the last thing that I would say is, to anyone watching, if you have an opportunity to travel with a group of designers, definitely take advantage of that. It really gave me a new perspective on that city. So thank you guys for having me along, and it's nice to see you all.
Yeah, likewise. And I just really appreciate every day. Things have kind of shifted in my work a little bit, but every day I use all these things that you're talking about. And in fact, I'm sitting here furiously writing notes and my pen has run out. I've been writing so many because there are just so many great ideas. And I think that's I think, as so many of you have said today, that's the thing we need is a forum to bring people together to come up with new ideas. Clearly the world has need of a lot of new ideas. And fortunately, you guys are some of the best minds I've encountered. So thank you very much for having me along.
Yeah.
Great. Dilip, maybe you want to chime in about development. And there was a question in the chat around COVID and Black Lives Matter and systemic injustice. I know, Dilip, that's something you've put a lot of thought into around development, et cetera, and this ideology. Maybe a few words from you would be great right now.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think sort of in response to what Vanessa was saying, I mean, you may not want to go with any designer, but you may, it's perhaps, and this is maybe to second Thad's earlier point, the template of this studio. And I like this word template that Andy introduced. I think that the template of the studio, is an accommodating one. And there's something to pointing out to the problems that we are facing today. I mean, we are talking about COVID-19, we're talking about racism today, we're talking about I mean, there are two ways to deal with these problems. One is actually to look at them in themselves, isolate them, and treat them, as it were, which many designers do. I mean, which is actually typically what an engineer might do, actually, when faced with a situation of flood or something like that. And then there is this larger sense that you don't solve the problem, but you resituate. You resituate it. You sort of lose it in a new context. Maybe the local context that Thad is talking about. Maybe that there is something to losing the problem in it, so that it surfaces very differently. When it I hate to say it like this, resolves itself. But there's something about solving a problem and resolving a problem. And I think that our template, the studio template, is very much directed toward resolving issues. And in that respect, I think we are more, more accommodating of voices. And here, I mean, I just want to say one thing about having Kelley and Vanessa actually with us. And we realize how much we speak with a journalistic voice. I mean, there is an element of critique that we bring to place. I think in the same manner that you guys bring to place. And to policy and to issues actually that go even deeper than policy, that are more sort of ingrained in our very perceptions and biases and prejudices, et cetera, et cetera. So that way, I think there was something that allowed me to sort of see our template from a journalistic point of view and realize how much we not just construct narratives, but we construct critical narratives and sort of mesh them into sort of non-linear, projective manner. So we are moving forward in a more complex way. And so I would like to think that our template will willingly accommodate, the COVID-19 crisis or the race crisis in a manner in which we resolve them. Rather than solve, the thing which an architect might do with a building or something like that. So here I feel there are a lot of connections with the theater, with and other models that we have been talking about. Yeah.
Well, I've got the sound of a pumping truck in the background, so I'm going to minimize my farewell. But this is not farewell. This is just the beginning. These conversations are designed to generate motion, and I love that idea of not resolving. These are emergent phenomena. They're not a problem you fix, although there is a system we can build. I think a system of integrated conversation with data and with iterative assessment that can generate community progress facing multiple landscape risks. Kate, thank you so much for and Thad and Dylan.
Thank you.
And everyone else here for being here today. I'm just going to do a little sign-off kind of a boilerplate with my wonderful septic pumping that illustrates the lack of planning in our little ancient village. Sustain What is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration and now the great pause that this virus has imposed on us through our own inaction. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's what's connecting us right now. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. As soon as we're done, share the link you've been watching on with friends and circles far and wide. There's plenty to do going forward, so share your ideas with me for next steps. In the scrolling bar at the bottom, you have contact information. And I want to just show you briefly. This is today's show. And on Friday, the next one is on the infodemic around the pandemic, which I've been dealing with a lot in our Sustain What conversations. How can we design a communication environment which isn't just storytelling? If I badger you about the value of a vaccine, I'm going to fail. If you create a landscape of opportunity where voices with data that are trusted on vaccines can be part of the mix amid the misinformation, then we won't fail. or we won't fail as badly. So Friday is on the infodemic with the World Health Organization and some great journalists. And again, just a farewell to my panel. Thank you so much for being here today, and stay well,
Thank
stay
you.
safe, stay resilient and adaptive.